This is lecture 2.2, where the structure of racism came from. In this lecture, we will be elaborating upon our first set of lectures in this unit, and we will be discussing racism as a more concrete structural definition. This isn't from your reader. I think this may be the first quote I use for this course that isn't from your reader. It is from Howard Zinn's A People's History of the United States. The country, therefore, was not, quote, born free, but born slave and free, servant and master, tenant and landlord, and rich. Zinn makes a very strong argument in this book that race was built into the American character, that it was done intentionally, and it was done to motivate slavery. And then what happened over the course of after slavery was dismantled, that this race structure in our society was not dismantled, and thus racism continues. Yeah, so that book on Zinn's People's History of the United States is actually readily downloadable on the internet. Zinn is dead himself, but his grandchildren recognized that Zinn didn't really respect copyright laws, so they have made that book available. And it's an amazingly good read. It's good that that is that way. So first we will recap the previous lecture, then we will discuss a timeline of American racism, starting at the pre-Columbus era, then talking about pre-slavery, slavery, the Jim Crow era, the Civil Rights era, and what we can call the modern era. You could also call that the post-Civil Rights era. I must warn you that this particular lecture has some rather graphic content and graphic pictures. If you don't want to see those, please send me an email and I can send you the notes without the graphic pictures, and you could, pretty easily listen to this lecture just by closing the windows so you just can't see it. So, now let's talk about our previous lecture. Racism in the United States is more than just not liking people based on their race. In the structural definition of racism, it is a complex social hierarchy with white people on top, black people on the bottom, and other people depending on the time period in between. And this is a very old system. It is a hundreds of years old system, and it is semi-unique in world history, American racism. Now, people, when race is brought up, will say things like, slavery was a long time ago, get over it. Well, I mean, that's kind of true. Slavery stopped, but everyone involved in it is dead, but social structures continue after people died. People got very, very rich during the slavery era. People were kidnapped from their homes, brought to the United States, and their ancestors continue to live in the United States and were very poor because of that, right? Those things didn't just magically disappear because Abraham Lincoln waved a magic wand, right? So, and those things are so embedded in American society that they haven't gone away in the 250 years since slavery ended. So the social structure of racism is informally enforced, and just a reminder, as I say over and over again, just because something is informally enforced does not mean it is not very real. It is socially constructed, and it is very real, and has very real implications to people involved. Now let's talk about this timeline of American racism. You should note that these are highlights, these things I'm going to mention. There are, you can easily teach courses, you could easily do an entire major on American racism, but these are just the highlights. To give you an idea of how racism is built into the social structure of the United States. I'm giving this bit of a history lecture. Dates are not as important to this as sequence of events. If you're not used to taking history courses on the college level, I want you to understand the sequence of events. I don't need you to understand exact dates, and I will not ask you exact dates, but I want you to know how one thing led to another, led to another, led to another. So the first thing, the first piece, the first step I want you to understand is the before Columbus era, the pre-Columbus era. And during this era, the thing to understand is that civilization existed before Columbus and likely would have become sophisticated without Europeans. As a grand overview, there were several civilizations present in the Americas prior to the arrival of Christopher Columbus. In chronological detail and order. From 1200 BC to 400 BC, the Olmec civilization reigned through Central America. This was a sophisticated stone carving civilization, and these stone carvings, these massive heads, 10, 15 feet tall, and these jade masks, this is all we have left from most of their society, and we cannot reproduce it, right? Which suggests that they were incredibly technologically advanced for that era. From 200 BC to 400 AD, there were a series of civilizations known as the Hopewell civilization. Now, we have, and the Hopewell civilization existed more up in North America. It's actually named after a town in Ohio, just south of where I live. And this Hopewell civilization existed effectively as a series of trade routes. So it was a series of relatively advanced civilizations with advanced trading techniques. The name Hopewell civilization is a little bit of a misnomer. It's almost like calling our civilization the Amazon.com civilization. But there was advanced trading happening in North America from 200 BC to 400 AD, in a time when not too much was happening in Northern Europe. From 1200 AD to 1521 AD, the Aztecs ruled in what is now Mexico, well, southern Mexico. The Aztecs were highly advanced in terms of astronomy, and they had a highly advanced astrological and astronomical calendar. And this calendar was so advanced that it predicted astrological events up until 2012, which some people made a big deal about that end date. But that's a full 500 years after their society collapsed. From 1438, from 1438 to 1533, the Incan Empire reigned. The Incan Empire was known for complex engineering and road structures. They also were known for the priest city of Machu Picchu, which is high up in the Andes Mountains. It's a place where we might not be able to build a city today because it was so remote and so high up in the air and so precise in the way that they put those stones together. I do not abide by ancient alien theories. I think they are, I'm not saying that aliens don't exist anywhere in the universe, but it's insulting to these ancient people to say that they could not have come up with this stuff. These were smart people. These were intelligent people. These were advanced people. And had the Europeans not come to the Americas, they would have produced the same things that Europeans produced. So in the pre-slavery era, I want you to focus on understanding that the French, British, Portuguese, and Spanish came, they divided the Americas, and they had no respect for native populations. This all lays the groundwork for the disrespect that was built in to what is American racism. So like I said, so in 1492 Columbus arrived with in what are now the Bahamas, and he made first contact with the indigenous peoples of North America. Now it is for those who are hypercritical of Columbus, they give the perception that he immediately took slaves, that he immediately started murdering people. That is not historically accurate, but he was not opposed to slavery. And he did suggest to kings and to the Pope, in a bid to make his efforts worthwhile, in order basically to sell his voyages, he told the royalty that, yeah, maybe we could make these people slaves. But Columbus himself did not take those slaves, which is a little bit hair-splitty. Certainly that's a reprehensible thing to propose, but, in the name of historical accuracy. 1513, the Spanish conquistadors, with the information they had from Columbus's voyages, started claiming huge territories in the name of the church and the Kingdom of Spain. And they did this, and they sought gold and other resources as well. They sought some converts, but more importantly were territory and riches. Simultaneously, during the conquistador era, from 1545 to 1519, European diseases swept through North and South America, and this event would become absolutely critical to the settling of North and South America. So diseases such as measles, bubonic plague, smallpox, malaria, viral hemorrhagic fever, these diseases that were deadly in the Old World, so Europe and Africa, had not come over through natural means to the Americas. And when they did come over, the people that were in the Americas had no immunity to those diseases. So it was absolutely devastating. We now have cures for some of these diseases, but to a population that had no immunity, it basically emptied out a lot of the land in North and South America. When colonists then got there, when conquistadors got there, and they said, there's hardly anyone here, there's nothing here, there's no civilizations here. Well, that's because those civilizations were mostly decimated by those diseases. And it gave the illusion of open land, or the land being a gift from God to these people, while in reality it was caused by the plagues that the Europeans were bringing. 1596, the British attempt to enslave Native Americans. This was a major turning point in the history of the colonizing of North America. It did actually fail, and it failed because the natives knew the terrain. The Native Americans knew what food was good to eat, and they knew how to escape, right? Imagine someone kidnaps you from one town over, maybe 2 towns over. Well, if you escaped, you'd know how to get back, right? So they recognized that failure, and then they started to kidnap people from Africa, right? And they succeeded because the Americas were completely foreign to the Africans. And after they had been kidnapped from Africa, put on slave ships, many of them died and then thrown onto the beaches of the Americas, those people were unable to escape, and they were unable to escape the way the Native Americans did. And they couldn't get back across the sea to get home, right? For a really good historical fictional account of slavery and what slavery was like, the book Roots that came out in the 1960s is, again, not completely historically accurate, but a good piece of historical fiction. I would suggest that reading. So, within the slavery era. Africans were kidnapped by Europeans, imported to America, and then start to be socially constructed as subhuman. Africans were kidnapped by Europeans. Oh, I just said that. Sorry. In 1600, Africans were kidnapped by Europeans and imported to the New World. They were set up in what was known as the Triangle Trade, in which rum was traded for sugar, sugar was traded for people, slaves, and then slaves were traded for rum again. Yeah, so people were being traded just like any other commodity. Meanwhile, and this is something that is brought up when people start to say, well, slavery wasn't really that bad. Yes, slavery was really that bad. But there was another thing also happening to European people at the same time. Meanwhile, in the 1600s, religious wars were ravaging Europe, leaving millions of refugees homeless. So some of those refugees fled to American colonies as indentured servants, where they would work for creditors until they, quote-unquote, were paid back. Some people make the argument that indentured servitude was as bad as slavery. It absolutely wasn't. It was very, very hard. Indentured servants had colossal debt, and maybe they weren't able to pay it back in their lifetime. Maybe their children would eventually pay it back. But they were treated with respect, and they were treated as if they were human beings, while slaves were treated as if they were animals, right? And not nice animals, animals that you really don't care if they live or die, right? That's the difference. This picture image right here is actually the certificate of indentured servitude that from one of my ancestors, for Ulrich Spiker. I believe he's my 10th great-grandfather. I am the ancestor of indentured servants. And if you're white in the United States, if your family has been here for since before about the 1840s or 1850s, you probably too are the ancestor of indentured servants. Immigrants to the United States, and I'm talking about this because race is more than just white and black, right? There are grades of whiteness, there are grades of blackness in the structure of American racism, and this was starting to be built during this era. Immigrants were encouraged to come to the United States based on their quote-unquote whiteness, right? What white meant to the people of this era, right? And remember, this is based largely on ideology. This is not based on science. This is based on how people perceived and categorized other people. So white during this era meant English, Scandinavian, or German Protestants. Those immigrants that weren't considered white enough would face discrimination. So Italians, many Irish, Jews, and Catholics would be considered not white enough. They would be considered not quite white, which is, it sounds very strange to us in our modern society with our concepts of race, but that's what race looked like to them. So, 1776, the founders debated ending slavery. This is a very real thing built into the American Constitution, and up until the end of the Civil War, it was part of the Constitution. This thing known as the Three-Fifths Compromise, that we acknowledged we had slaves. Some people were saying, yeah, we need to get rid of slavery now, and good for them. But there were other politicians that said, no, we're not going to get rid of slavery. The compromise there was that they would count slaves toward the end of representation and toward the end of taxing, where each slave would count for 3/5 of a person in terms of the tax that must be given to the federal government. And they would also count toward being 3/5 of a person in terms of representatives that would go to Congress, which sounds absolutely absurd to us, that human beings would count as 3/5 of a person, But at that era, that sounded like what a political compromise would be, right? Because there were people that were saying, no, slaves are 0% human, right? These are non-humans, which sounds and is atrocious to us. In the 1830s, the concept of manifest destiny embedded itself in the American consciousness, in the American zeitgeist. The concept that the United States should spread from one coast to the other, right? We did not spread from the Pacific to Atlantic in the 1830s, right? But we decided that we would, right? And then that manifest destiny led to, in part, the Mexican-American War, which is a war we don't learn too much about. The Mexican-American War is a war that occurred between the United States and Mexico, in which we took about half of the land of Mexico. So where you are right now in New Mexico, California, Texas, that was all Mexico, right? And the United States, it could be argued, started a war to get more territory. And by the end of that war, the United States was given, as part of the concessions, half of that territory. That is now the United States that was green in that map over there. From 1861 to 1865, the American Civil War happened, and that was largely over slavery. There was a degree of it being about states' rights to be able to rule themselves, but the historical reality of it is that it was largely over definitions of what it means to be human. In 1863, the slaves were freed, but even though they were free, didn't mean they had anything, right? So many of them continued to work as low-pay farm laborers. There is significant historical evidence to show that many slaves didn't even know they were free for years after they were freed. But those that did learn that, many of them took part in what was known as the Great Migration up into the north of the United States. So many freed slaves then moved into places like Chicago, New York, but largely was up through the Midwest. So a lot of those Great Migration people went up to Chicago for hope of a better life up through the South. So after slavery ended, started the Jim Crow era, in which African Americans were systematically oppressed to maintain the highest degree of white privilege possible. And we talked about privilege in previous lectures, remember. So, from the 1860s to 1864, segregation became the law in southern states and was enforced in some areas outside of the South. So while, and this is stuff that we actually do learn about in American history classes, so we learned that there were white-only and black-only bathrooms and all of that in the South. But what we don't always harp on is that there were also white-only and black-only facilities in places outside of the Southeast. But it was not the absolute law. It was more of a tradition kind of thing. In 1865, the Ku Klux Klan formed and was founded in Pulaski, Tennessee. This group, the Klan is relatively infamous, and they formed as a result of fear, basically, of newly freed African Americans. In 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act prohibited all immigration from Chinese laborers, and this was the first law implemented to target a specific ethnic population. Laws that target immigration of specific ethnic populations are not a new thing. This has been with us for a very long time. And in 1896, Plessy versus Ferguson upheld that separate but equal could be established to justify segregation in the South and in other places as well. And that continued to uphold segregation in the South for the next 70 years or so. So to take a minor detour from the timeline, During this Jim Crow era, African Americans were not only marginalized legally, but they were humiliated in a mass scale in the entertainment industry. As entertainment, the punctuation in that sentence isn't great. And a major form of this entertainment were what were known as minstrel shows. So a minstrel show was a pre-motion picture kind of cheap theater that you could go to where people would act out little skits. And one of the major skits in these minstrel shows were this character known as Jim Crow. Jim Crow was a walking, talking black stereotype. He was similar to Paul Bunyan or Mickey Mouse or Santa Claus, right? He was more of a cultural character, and he was portrayed as lazy, as stupid, as poorly dressed for comic effect, right? It was basically a way to import into the theater, hey, check out this stupid black person, right? And how stupid he is and how hilarious it is that he's stupid. And this person was not played by a black person. Well, of course not. He was played by a white person in blackface. Here we see a classic example of an individual in blackface. Here we see a poster for such a minstrel show. And many of you may have seen, it's pretty old, but maybe you've seen the classic Dumbo Disney movie. These crows, if you don't know what they are culturally, they might just strike you as funny birds. But these crows, because they were also Jim Crow, right? If you rewatch that with this knowledge and pointing out the crows, they are walking, talking black stereotypes, is what they are. And they are portraying the negative characteristics of black people in the movie Dumbo. It's amazing to see what of your childhood has been destroyed because you didn't know you were looking at racism at the time. Let me tell you. So along the lines, continue this entertainment tangent. It continued into things like Carnival Games. Examples of African Dodger was one of these games, also known as Hit the N-Word Baby. Balls would be thrown either at pictures of black people, hypothetically, hopefully, but also faces of actual living black people. So in this lower picture, the black person's head would be stuck out. The person would basically be hired to stick his head through this hole and then duck out as soon as he could to keep from getting hit by baseballs. And this would frequently result in broken eye sockets, broken noses, concussions, serious damage to these living individuals. And, this is an era when healthcare was not good, right? So people were probably blinded, people were probably permanently maimed by this carnival game that were used to entertain white people. If you want to check me on that, you are more than welcome to check out snopes.com/factcheck/racist carnival game for a full detail on that one. But and I was doing some research on this one for this presentation, and I came across this as well, and this is a verified thing too. This is a early dunk tank, right? So it looks like, from what I'm observing, that early dunk tanks were also inspired by this African Dodger game, right? And the first people to be put in dunk tanks were black people, right? Making the joke that let's wash these terrible, dirty people. It's absolutely reprehensible. This is just absolute. And I've seen dunk tanks my whole life, and thought it was just something fun to put a principal in at a high school, right? But no, it's based on just the most despicable and ugly racism. It's really unbelievable. Black people were often the subjects of lynching and other forms of informal punishments. I'll give you a definition. Informal punishments are those that are distributed by individuals other than law enforcement and commonly held at the hands of groups of people. Other examples of informal punishments were tar and feathering, acid attacks, branding, and stonings, right? These are, if you would survive terrible ordeals, and if you were not survive, very ugly ways to die. These public hangings would often become public events with a picnic or party or celebratory atmosphere, right? Because the racism of the era did not allow white people to see non-whites basically as being human. And lynchings could take place for infractions as innocent as looking at a white man's wife. It wasn't necessarily for actual rapes. It wasn't necessarily for actual killings. It was for perceived slights to the authority of white people. And look at the picture on these people's faces. Look at that guy's picture right there. Smile. Look at these people's picture. They don't look horrified, right? They look interested, don't they? This is the nature of racism in the United States during this era. And have we gotten better? Yeah, we have. But this is our history. And we need to look at it, and we need to look at it hard. Because this is where we come from. But it's not just racism against African Americans. Indian schools were established in 1900 to, quote, kill the Indian and save the man. And children were being forcibly kidnapped from their families, from what were then reservations and other places Native Americans were living. They were forced to speak English, and they were forced to adopt white culture. 1915 to the mid-1920s, the Klan was flourishing and politically controlled many parts of the American South. And 1824 was the end of the last of the Indian Wars. So the Apache Nation officially surrendered to the United States government. That is within the lifetimes of some older people living today, right? They're quite old right now. But that is within the lifetime of living people, as we were having wars with Native Americans on American soil. Oh, sorry, wrong button. From 1932 to 1972, a experiment known as the Tuskegee syphilis experiment occurred, in which the U.S. government was funding a study of syphilis of already infected African Americans. When people talk about the Tuskegee syphilis experiment, they often mistake and say that black people were being intentionally infected by the government. That's not true. That is a urban legend or conspiracy theory. But what happened is almost as terrible, because in 1947, 15 years into the experiment, penicillin was proven to be a safe alternative cure, a safe and effective cure for syphilis, would absolutely cure it. Well, it then becomes a hideous thing that they didn't just say to these people that were in the study, we can cure this thing, let's get you fixed up, right? It continued until 1972. Hundreds of people died because of the inaction of the scientists involved in the study, because they saw African Americans as less than human. There's an amazingly good book. It's called Bad Blood by James Jones. There's a picture of it down here in the corner. It's available on Amazon. If this is something that interests you, it's a thick book, but it's very much worth the read. So, 1941, U.S. enters World War II. 1942 to 1946 were the internment of Japanese Americans in what were effectively concentration camps in the United States. Now, they were not the same as the concentration camps of the Germans during World War II, right? Obviously, the ones that were in Nazi Germany were actually trying to murder people, and they did murder people very effectively. But we too, as Americans, rounded up our citizens and put them in camps. There were camps for German Americans as well in the United States, but there were far fewer of those camps during that era. for German Americans, Germans living in the United States. And by most accounts, the camps for German Americans were actually far more humane, because there was this perception of Japanese people as being non-American and not quite human, right? In 1945, the United States and Allied forces defeated the Nazis and the German Empire. The reason I put that in there is to mark that note it was a full year before we left the people out of the Japanese internment camps after that war. 1948, Woody Guthrie, who was a folk singer, came out with his song Deportees, which chronicles the plight of Latino migrant workers in the American South and Southwest. And the reason I point this out is because this song is from 1948, 70 years ago. If I'm doing my math right, I'm not sure if I am. It's hard to do math and have a lecture at the same time. But it highlights the long-lived controversy regarding Latino immigration. If you listen to the Guthrie song Deportees, it's talking about the exact same thing we're talking about regarding Latino immigration in the United States. And then if you take that back yet another step, you can remind yourself that the area that Latino immigration is the heaviest is the area that was Mexico prior to the Mexican-American War. 1954, Brown versus the Board of Education ruled that separate was not indeed equal. So Plessy versus Ferguson was struck down, and this ended segregation in the public school system legally, right? There are still many, many schools in the United States that are and continue to be segregated de facto, right? Not legally. But that continues, right? Just because segregation is illegal doesn't mean it doesn't still continue. So, during the Civil Rights era, and I do start to skim a little bit here, maybe you're saying, thank God, he's starting to skip over some things, because we did learn, at least I learned a little bit about the Civil Rights era in high school. This is when African Americans struggled to be granted the same rights as white people, and I hope this is obvious to you at this point. I'm focusing mainly on African Americans because they have been the most systematically discriminated against in this whole system, right? Of course, like I said in previous lectures, no one wins the oppression Olympics. Of course Latinos were discriminated against. Of course Japanese Americans, Native Americans, and every other minority and many white people were also discriminated against. But African Americans were discriminated the most systematically. So, December 1st, 1955, Rosa Parks refuses to give up her seat in an act of civil disobedience. February 1st, 1960, 4 college students refused to leave a whites-only lunch counter, and they treated them very poorly. September 15th, 1963, the bombing of a 16th Street Baptist Church in Alabama killed 4 young girls, injured several others, and these bombings fueled angry protests. August 28th, 1963 was Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. In 1964, Malcolm X gave his ballot or the bullet speech, and in part of that he says, it'll be the ballot or the bullet. It'll be liberty or death, and if you're not ready to pay the price, don't use the word freedom in your vocabulary. So what was he saying? He said, a violent revolution may occur, right? That's what he was saying. We don't often hear about this when we're talking about the Civil Rights era, but there were people talking about violent and bloody revolution in an effort to get civil rights for black people. That's not to say that that would have been better. It probably would have been grisly and horrifying, but that is the counterbalance to Martin Luther King's arguments that he was making, right? This is a conversation the civil rights movement was having within itself. It wasn't all peace and love and understanding. Thank goodness that's what occurred, but there was a conversation. In 1965, Malcolm X was assassinated. In 1968, Martin Luther King was assassinated. And in 1983, the first Martin Luther King Day was observed. So this moves us into the modern era, where the struggle does continue. In 1980, and I include in here presidents because this is when, some of us were alive, so the presidents begin to be a bit of a flag post for where we are in history. Ronald Reagan was elected president, and in the early 1980s was the quote-unquote crack epidemic. And crack cocaine was a new drug in the United States, and harsh penalties were put into place for crack cocaine. And why crack was seen as so dangerous was because it was seen as a black person's drug. And police presence was increased in quote-unquote highest risk neighborhoods, i.e. poor black neighborhoods. In 1988, President George H.W. Bush was elected president, and he campaigned on a tough-on-crime party platform that was big for his getting elected president. And one of his campaign ads showed a weakness of his opponent, Dukakis, as being regarding a highly questionable campaign ad in which focused on the race of a convicted criminal named Willie Horton. And it claimed that candidate Dukakis granted Horton a quote-unquote day pass from prison. He misrepresented what was prison policy in the campaign ad. And by most standards, it was a pretty dirty campaign ad. But it worked, and it was effective, and it focused on fear of black people. In the 1990s, we've talked about colorblindness as not being a solution for solving racism. Well, this concept of colorblindness really set in American culture. And in 1992, then, Rodney King was beaten by police after a routine traffic stop. This event was caught on VHS tape and played on the local news. And this sparked what was known as the Los Angeles riots, in which blocks and blocks and blocks, huge portions of Los Angeles were burnt and rioted in race riots. Then also in 1992, Bill Clinton was elected president. And Bill Clinton continued the same tough-on-crime rhetoric as George H.W. Bush, right? And Clinton was a Democrat and Bush was a Republican, but Clinton continued the tough-on-crime rhetoric. And this type of policy combined with the war on drugs, racial profiling techniques created a massive overrepresentation of African Americans in the American prison system. And we can see this just by looking at basic numbers. 65% of the American population is white, 12% of the American population is black. But 35% of the prison population is white, 38% is black, 20% is Latino. That says it all, right? If we had equal representation, then 65% of the prison population would be white, right? But we don't. We have a racist prison system. We have a racist, structurally racist society, and this is how it pans out. This is the best evidence for the thing, are those populations in American prisons. The only other explanation for this is that black people are inherently more prone to crime than white people, and that is completely untrue. 100% untrue. The only rational explanation for this overrepresentation is systemic racism. Period. In 2000, George W. Bush was elected president, and we all know on 9/11/2001, the Twin Towers and the Pentagon was attacked by Islamic fundamentalists. This fundamentally changed the way Muslims and Arab Americans are able to live in the United States. TSA and the Department of Homeland Security were established and implemented security protocols that have been criticized for unduly harassing Muslims and Arab Americans. In 2001, the Patriot Act limited many of the rights of Americans, redefined how we think of privacy and undue search and seizure, right? So the Patriot Act, really changed how we view our privacy in our homes. and changed when a police officer is able to look through your things and when they aren't able to look through your things. That is a major cultural moment for the United States. And this war on terror was declared toward the end of eliminating Al-Qaeda and ending the weapons of mass destruction programs of Saddam Hussein. 2003, 2 years later, Bush declared mission accomplished in Iraq. That's when we thought the war in Iraq was over. It still isn't. 2003, Latinos become the largest racial or ethnic minority group in the United States. Completely unrelated to the previous thing, it just also happened in 2003. 2006, Saddam Hussein was executed in Iraq, and those weapons of mass destruction, those nuclear bomb programs, those anthrax programs were never found in Iraq. The reason why we were led to believe that we had to invade Iraq were never found. 2008, Barack Obama was elected president, and some people at that moment declared Americans' race problems would be at an end. And we continue to have race problems. 2010, Arizona passes laws that require people to prove citizenship if police ask. And this was enforced almost exclusively on racial profiling, because white people were and continue not to be asked to prove their citizenship in the same way that Latino people are forced to. In 2011, Osama bin Laden was assassinated by U.S. Special Forces, and today the war on terror continues more than 7 years after the assassination of Osama bin Laden and 12 years after the execution of Saddam Hussein. This makes the war on terror the second longest war in U.S. history, second only to Vietnam, that lasted 20 years. And in all likelihood, it probably will be number one eventually. 2012. Oh yeah, this is a new thing. 2012, Arizona passes laws prohibiting the teaching of ethnic studies classes, enforced based... Oh, I'm sorry. I'm getting a little loopy. And this was enforced based on banning teaching of Mexican or Latino culture. So laws were passed basically prohibiting the teaching of Mexican and Latino culture in high schools. In 2014, the Black Lives Matter movement started after the prominent documentation of violence against young black men via social media. This was caused by the murder of several young black men by police officers. And to put it into perspective, I was at a presentation of Kathleen Cleaver, who was a former Black Panther and scholar. And she said, if you think cops just started killing black young men, think again, right? She's absolutely right. It's not that the killing of young men just started. It's that we just started to notice it. And we just started to document it, right? And we have the technology. Everyone has a phone. Everyone has a camera, right? It took off on Twitter. It took off with Black Lives Matter because technology has caught up with our ability to let everyone know these things. And so, no, it's not a new problem, but it's a problem we're finally starting to deal with. And I think that is actually a very good and promising thing. In 2016, Donald Trump was elected president, and his administration is openly hostile to Latino and Muslim immigrants. I don't think that is an opinionated statement. That is a pretty sound, neutral statement. They don't want more Latino immigration. They don't want more Muslim immigration, period. And that definitely has race ramifications. Yeah, heavy lecture. As I've stated in the past, sociology is a bummer. So if you have any questions, please let me know. Send me an email. Bring things up in the message boards, and I will talk to you soon.